Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog Solo. And I'm just gonna admit my conversations with three people. My friend Keith, frenemy of the show eternally, but one of the people who makes me think harder than anyone else I deal with. My friend Erica Robelas Anderson, thinker of kinship, social reproduction, and what seemingly conservative social groups do right that reproduce outcomes that leftists would have to do uh, to have their own social subject met. Not merely mimicking the values of conservatives are the political talking points of conservatives. It's deeper than that. And when you actually look at the deeper structures, it makes liberals uncomfortable and it makes leftists uncomfortable. And lastly, Jake B, who left a comment that I'm going to read to you and share with you today on my last video. There are no adults in the room. Part 2, the toddlers are in their 80s. Let me share this with you here. Jake B says, I agree completely. I've become increasingly frustrated listening to people chanting half truths about our current moment at each other and expecting that if everyone acknowledged their half truth, everything would fall into place. As a side note, Jake B, I've called this Marxio narcissism or political Gnosticism, the belief that knowledge is the primary problem. Like, this is not that different from liberal belief in education, that there's a universal truth that all you have to do is acknowledge and you'll be there, even if it's a material truth. The acknowledgement of the material truth will arrive. That is not how anything fucking works. If that's what you've grokked from Marxism, maybe Marxism isn't serving you. Anyway, back to the piece. I am more and more convinced that the left as a subculture has no prospect of bringing about a paradigm shift than any of the old organized religions do. I would say this is true for all the subcultures in the political world right now, although the left is different and has different demands and has different strategic problems than, say, the far right or even the paleo conservative right or, the nationalist right or whatever. But all of them spin their wheels and produce very little and are subsumed back into the basic apparatus of the center of the state. But the center of the state has no action. It's literally in its 80s and 90s as managers. There's no backbench. There's no movement. There's no attempt to bring movement. There's no attempt to even reason from the standpoint of that point of view because it sees itself as morally justified, as having moral legitimacy, not even the legitimacy of competence, which is always a limited competence anyway, as competence gets more specialized, as any system gets more complex. But going back to Jake here. I always agree with you about the hypercomplexity of the current world order and the inability of any one person or faction to understand it fully and take effective action to address our issues. But it's become the only thing I see when there's a political and cultural discussions now. It's even a big part in driving me back to religious belief, although not away to my commitment to some kind of left universalist project. However, I believe more and more that this means that we must start pulling this completely alienated and sectarian social order back together. We need to humble ourselves, create bridges in our communities that allow for real mutual responsibility, accountability, dialogue between people who we are no longer talking to. Absolutely. But we need more than that. See, to have dialogue between people, you need to be able to hold them accountable to you and hold yourself accountable to them. Otherwise, the dialogue isn't meaningful. We can have interfaith discussions or inter-community discussions or inter-identity discussions all day. We can listen to people's pain and stories and understand their standpoint. But if we don't have accountability to each other, that doesn't really mean shit except for our own consciences. And our own consciousness are not a social subject. Back to this. Perhaps this is incredibly idealistic and naive of me. I'm religious now, so it's undeniable that such things would be my natural inclination. But I really do believe that the historic task of the left is to negotiate the end of the war that is our stratified society. It cannot be done without the masses united in a common interest. That would require the masses, whatever you mean by that, to have a common interest, to have mutual accountability, mutual rights, and duties. But most people cannot see their self interest beyond their own interest. The idea that an obligation would actually have a benefit to you eludes most young people that I know, because it eludes most older people that I know too. Thus, you do not see an investment into the future. After all, if you're supporting pensions off of student loan backed securities, you are literally eating someone else's future to support the current. And in that way, one generation is rich, and it's not all the generation, let's be clear here, is structurally eating all beneath them that is also supporting them. But they're not going to pass that back down. Since it is consumed and not reinvested, and since reinvestment doesn't matter in our current culture in a real, meaningful way, since the consumer's culture needs to eat perpetually to keep itself flowing and doesn't see much purpose for reinvestment except for the prolonging of abstract value, not for the repeated infrastructure, not for building back up its own capacity. If it does that, it does that only because it has to in the last instance. And acting as though we have the mass buy in for an alternative project before we do has not gone well for us or for anyone else. No, it has not. Most, quote, identitarian projects, whether left or right, fail for this reason too. I don't judge people of the past for acting as if they did. However, I am ever more certain that we have learned both too much from our enemies and not enough. The left cannot come to power the way any other political movement can without destroying itself in the process. I don't have the answers, but I believe it must start by meeting others where they are. Not by pretending we have no differences, but by acknowledging that we need each other to get out of this mess, and even people whose views we find reprehensible. The left can continue to be just one more subculture, or we can fulfill our duty and start doing the work needed to create a shared project for all our people. I have no right to scold anyone. I'm still trying to get my own life together. And I know many people are doing great work. When I look at the broad left, I don't see enough humility or curiosity. I don't see it enough anywhere. Although the left, this is particularly problematic because right wingers don't promise some of the things that require that, and we do. I do appreciate channels like this. Good work is done on the left, but as Varn says, the left can't even really see the whole thing for what it is. I mean, can you even articulate what the thing is? It's not just capitalism anymore, my friends. It's not just imperialism. It's not just or multipolarity. You keep on looking at one part of the elephant, but you're blinded to the entire elephant. Everyone is. Me too. And I think our task is to build something that can, and that means building bridges, not burning them, which is what every side on this cultural and political divide is doing. Sometimes you have to burn bridges. You do. But there should be a reason why you have to do it. I'm a values pluralist, but I must admit that one of the problems that you have as a values pluralist is that you can't always say that someone else's values are not serving them if you don't have a meta criterion for judgment. Which brings me back to the LARPy nature of all this. I struggle with a lot of the things said in Christopher Lash. I'm not a believer in a lot of the kinds of morality that often get posited, but I do believe in self-discipline, and I do believe in responsibility, and I do believe in obligation. And if that makes me conservative sounding to you, and I'm sure to a lot of you it does, my response to you is, how do you build a subject that has the strength to even reform the society, much less overthrow all of it? A world where the bourgeoisie, no matter how deracinated it gets, can privately afford cluster bombs, not even dealing with the state. How do you deal with the fact that most of you want the state to create an internal system of token exchange that makes you subordinate to the state itself? A state that, under our Constitution, applies fiscal discipline to everything but war in its own insurance policies, aka entitlements. That Marxists themselves have so bought into the quote end of the contradictions of capitalism from Paul Z Ford that they don't deal with the fact that all they're trying to do is bring back the system that led to this system in the first place most of the time. They want their Fordism back. They want their New Deal back. That's the best we can do. That'll teach us the working class. Grow up, it led us here already. You come to me and you say, well, the Soviet Union existed. We can do what Lenin did. Okay, fine. But what mistakes did Lenin make that led to what happened? Oh, that was just Stalin. That was just that was just international capital. Fuck you. That's the world that they lived in. They had to deal with the world that they lived in. And if every concession led to their undoing and you repeat it, you are the one making a mistake. Do not make a virtue of the necessity when the necessity also undid the host. We have to deal in our own societies. Now, all these nations are synthetic. We don't actually share a national interest. It's a botched metaphor for kinship anyway. You share an interest to people who have an interest in you, who you really see yourself as an extension of. None of us actually, really, at the end of the day, see ourselves as an extension of our own country. And that is, for most people, the first and foremost, hidden primary LARP. The reason why the left feels like a LARP is because most things feel like a LARP. Look at evangelical religion. Can it stand a part of contemporary politics? No, it's subsumed to it. You're like, oh, it's always been that way. It goes in and out. Religions expand and contract, but when they are powerful, historically speaking, they have their own logics. They're not subsumed to other secular ones. When they are weak, they are subsumed to secular ones. And it betrays the judgment that they don't have a way to stand apart. The past was not as religious as most people think, but in so much that it was it was because these institutions could stand apart. We've seen these evangelical institutions unable to cultivate a mind of their own. I make this point over and over and over again. They have to outsource their thinking to Jewish and Catholic intellectuals. It's not because Protestants are innately stupid. Why has that happened? What traits did they cultivate? What material part of their world did they not change? You want to be a good materialist, but you don't want to be just to the realm of stochastic change are secretly believing God while denying it, because all of you who think that the theology means that things must go the way that you think it should go, which historically most Marxists have, and one of the things I've been really harping on at this channel is people just admit that and quit pretending that if you read between the lines, they didn't mean what they obviously said they meant because it didn't happen. I mean, that's not unique to Marxists. That's the history of like most millenarian religious sects. But we're not supposed to be a millenarian religious sects. We're not supposed to be lapsarians either. Every values judgment, everything you do implies a conception of the world and a hermeneutic of the world. And I'm going to have to go into hermeneutics in another video. But most of you try to have your cake and eat it too. You cannot reconcile what you say you believe and what you believe. Oh, we can make posts on TikTok. People have been consciousness raising forever. And you know what they did? They hit a wall. You know what happened to the new left? They hit a wall. And how did it respond to that? LARPy terrorism, which didn't even really do anything, just blew up a bunch of buildings. And if you don't know that history, go look it up. Look at how many bombings there were in the early 1970s. And then what did a lot of them go into? Organized crime. Or they got arrested, or they became normal Democrats. They conceded to the reality of the situation. Someone came to me in my thing today. I won't name them, but they were like, "Well, there's nobody in that. There's nobody. There's not that many middle-aged leftists still leading us, you know." And I was like, "Huh. Well, there's a lot more leftists in their 30s and 40s than when I was around because the Gen X left basically didn't exist. It was all issue driven, and then basically went into countercultural things. There are a few exceptions, but most of them now are like media figures." And I'll get to the way the media has played into this in a second. But you have a deracinated center, marginal or modal politics around it where all the action is, but it's just spinning its tail on nonsense and alienating people more and more as it does so, throwing them between all kinds of wacky different politics because they just want movement because everything feels so stuck. I was talking to people about heuristics of trust before, and I know this doesn't seem the same, but heuristics of trust aren't good enough. You have to be able to have a reason to evaluate who you trust and why, not just that you trust them. Because that you trust them, you're just largely going to be reinforcing the people that you think look like you. And with specialists in particular, and I deal with specialists all the time, I deal with academics a lot. They're brilliant as a specialist and you need them as a specialist, but they often outsource their understanding. Someone was coming to me the other day. It's like Joseph Tainter seems to be naturally doing historical materialism, and yet he also seems to have really botched understandings of Marx. I'm like, it wasn't his specialty, so he trusted the dominant heuristics and critiques of Marx of the 1970s when he was writing that book in the 1980s. He read Marx through what he knew about Marx already, and most of you do that, by the way. Even most great Marxists do it. It is hard to read something outside of an interpretive tradition that has a material material institution or educational praxis or whatever backing it up. And it takes bravery to do it, and you have to make judgment calls, and you have to stand on those judgment calls because you have to start prioritizing the information, and you have to do it yourself, and you have to prioritize the people you trust, and you have to have a mechanism for doing that other than that you trust them. You can't just go, oh, these people that I like, they do this. That's how gurus are born. But a lot of the specialists who do this outsource this thinking to other specialists and not realizing they're kind of doing the same thing the guru mongers are. I don't have an easy answer for this. Society is super complex now. It's impossible to be an expert in everything. But that's why everything feels like a LARP. You go protest, make a lot of movement. Does it change the political world? I've been saying this for years. There's reasons to protest, by the way. There are. There absolutely are. But you go protest now? Do you think it really changes the world for you? For anybody? Hmm? I mean, every 2 years we have the next biggest protest that we've had ever. You raise consciousness because it's something you can do. It gives you the feeling of doing something. Now, it's not just lowly actionism. People will say, oh, Varn, you have such a high standard. I've been getting a lot of pushback now for me saying, no, you have to make concessions to reality. Like believing in the maximum program and yet having no means to attain it except waiting forever and knowing that you had the invariant program and you believed in it. That's a way of abrogating responsibility. It's a way of doing nothing. Makes you feel real good. Oh, I'm not LARPing. I'm waiting for the possibility to bring about the invariant program, even though we always fail at everything we do. Come on now. Grow up. I could be a lot more famous if I monetized this and lied to you, told you what you wanted to hear. Be easier to get guests on. I could find sponsors easier if I wanted it. I have a day job, and I will maintain having a day job because I think we have to deal with the fact that a lot of you aren't getting good information. That and you have highly biased freelance journalists through Substack, and it's better to have that than not. I mean, we have to hold the fact that that journalism failed, but most of you go, well, we have to change stuff nationally, or we have to go into localism. And I'm like, well, localism, you're fighting against international things, not just national ones. So you're fucked. But if you don't have an understanding of local politics, local institutions, class autonomous institutions, etc., what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And you need information to do that, but you're not going to get that information from a podcast because the diffusion of the media network makes it impossible to do. I can't make enough money off of my own community to just serve my own community this way, even on ads. Look at your alt weeklies, which became like every city's official gentrification paper. They moved from alternative media to established media to now barely holding on. And what's in the news? You go to Newsbreak, half of it's written by AI. I have a Newsbreak AI article saying like the Utah minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, which is slightly higher than the national minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. I'm like, yeah, you can't even, like, the AI is not smart enough to figure out that it's wrong on a basic thing, and this is a news program using it. So that's going to replace Twitter being where half the news articles came from. It's not being done by the AP. No wonder you don't know what's going on in your communities. You go, I'm an organizer. What are you fucking organizing? All right. Mutual aid. Is it mutual aid or is it voluntary dependence group? Oh, you go, I'm going to have a patronage network. Okay. Is your patronage network going to be from your own people? Or is it going to be an outsider? Because you can go, I get rid of all the ads of the NGOs by having a patronage network of rich people who tell us what to do and fund us. And believe me, I've been in left organizations that had secret funders. In fact, they were so secret that when I took over the organization, I didn't know where our money came from. And I found out later why a certain dead leftist hated me is because I accidentally absconded with his front organization, which he was paying for. Now, microtransactions have actually ended a lot of that, but now it's made a lot of people just sell people what they want to hear. You know how many massive YouTubes are going on right now where people are now able to quit their day jobs to pawn you politics that they have no way of enacting with analysis that might be good, but they have no way of doing, that it appeals to your 19-year-old alienation? Come the fuck on. Like and subscribe. If you want more rants like this, you can always find more behind the Patreon. Have a great day.